And of course, when we're talking about the North and South poles, we're talking about the Arctic and the Antarctic, those two polar opposite regions of the Earth. And with Antarctica, we're dealing with an entire continent that covers that region. And we know this thing is covered in ice. 98% of the continent is covered in ice. And this ice sheet over the continent gets up to 3 miles thick. So the ice is actually elevating the continent above the landmass underneath. So the actual continent of Antarctica is buried under miles of ice. It's actually seen as the biggest desert in the world because there is literally no civilian population on the continent, no civilians permanently living on the continent at all. And it is the only continent in the world without a known native population. As far as they tell us, this entire continent has never had an indigenous population. You've had explorers that have passed through it, but nobody has actually ever settled here. Then we've got the Arctic region, which is all these surrounding land masses, Russia, Canada, Greenland, Norway, Alaska. And then right in the center of all this, you have the North Pole, which is actually sitting right in the middle of the Arctic Ocean. And unlike Antarctica, there is no landmass at the North Pole. It is literally just an ice sheet floating on top of the Arctic Ocean. There is nothing else around. It is a giant ice sheet surrounded by water, and the nearest land is 700 miles away. And the water itself is 29 degrees, just below the freezing point. And the surrounding temperature gets down as low as negative 93 degrees Fahrenheit. So, of course, just like Antarctica, the North Pole is completely uninhabited. And you had a lot of explorers that have attempted to reach these two regions because obviously it's a big deal being able to say you made it to the top and the bottom of the known world. You get the first scientific expedition at the North Pole in 1948. It was called the Sever 2 expedition. And this was over 24 Russian scientists specifically landing on the North Pole to make scientific observations, to analyze the polar ice sheet, and to map out the ocean directly underneath the pole. And they basically used echo sounding to map out the depth of the water. What they did report was that they had found evidence of an underwater mountain ridge. So basically a chain of mountains between the ice and the water under the North Pole. Now, what's crazy about this is that if you remember the Mercator map, the most popular map used for navigation, it's been used by sailors for centuries. And when you look at the Mercator map of the Arctic, it's going all the way back to 1569. Right at the center of the Arctic Circle, you can clearly see 4 separate land masses, supposed to be 4 separate islands surrounding the North Pole. And then right at the center is a mountain. And this mountain is described as being 33 miles wide and being made of some sort of like lodestone or magnetite rock. And again, sitting right in the middle of the Arctic Ocean, right in the middle of the North Pole. And the mountain is recorded under the name Rupes Nigra on the map. And this was all recorded in Latin. And in Latin, the term Rupes translates to rocks. And then, of course, Nigra translates to black. So Rupes Nigra translates to black rocks. And you get down to the root word rupa, and it's referring to any type of object or formation. So Rupes Nigra would be a black object or black formation. And then you look at the word rupa as a noun, and it literally means pit or hole, which would translate to black pit or black hole. A black pit or black hole at the center of the North Pole. And the deeper you go down into a hole or pit within the earth, you're literally talking about rocks shrouded in darkness, aka black rocks. And Mercator actually described this whirlpool in the middle of the North Pole where this black rock sits. and that the water from the Arctic Ocean empties into this whirlpool. Now you got to think, because we're talking about the northernmost point of the Earth's axis of rotation, this whirlpool that Mercator is talking about could actually be describing the Earth's rotation that formed this rupes nigra, this black pit or black hole, and the water that rushed into it as it was buried under the Arctic Ocean. Now, we don't really know how Mercator came across this information. He claimed to have received it secondhand from some source that, we don't really know. And the map actually wasn't released until 5 years after he passed away by his son. So there is no way to know how he came across this information. But we know that it was confirmed in 1963 that there is an underwater mountain ridge in the upper west region of the Arctic Ocean, just across from the North Pole. And then in 1969, it was confirmed that there was a separate mountain ridge in the lower eastern region of the Arctic Ocean. And then in 1979, that mountain ridge directly under the North Pole that the Sever 2 expedition reported was confirmed to exist directly under the North Pole. In 1987, it was confirmed that there is a fourth mountain ridge sitting at the northern region of the Arctic Ocean. Again, right across from the North Pole. So we've got 4 separate mountain ridges surrounding the North Pole, and one that runs directly under the North Pole. And then we've got this map showing these 4 land masses surrounding the North Pole with a chain of mountains at the center. So it's almost like we're looking at these same exact land masses, just now buried under the Arctic Ocean. Because remember, they're saying these are mountain ridges, basically a chain of mountainous formations. So it sounds like we have land masses buried under the Arctic Ocean. And we know there's supposed to be ancient land masses that existed near the North Pole millions of years ago. And the thought is that somehow, millions of years ago, this entire ancient Antarctica region sank under the ocean. And the question is, are these mountain ridges this ancient Antarctica? Because we know all of these ridges are formed from continental crust, which would suggest that they were a part of some larger land masses at some point. And these are massive. The average length of one of these ridges is 1,100 miles long and 124 miles wide. And if they are actual land masses, who knows just how well preserved they actually are. Because you would imagine with them being in the Arctic that at one point in time, they were completely covered in ice. And that it was possibly the melting of that ice that submerged them deep under the Arctic Ocean. And as the Arctic sea levels just continue to rise, these land masses just continually got buried deeper and deeper under that ocean. Because just within the last 26 years, the sea levels in the Arctic have consistently risen around 2.2 millimeters every single year. So if you got that same process occurring over thousands of years, you can see how these land masses could have been just completely submerged deep within the ocean, and why they would be just nearly impossible to get to, because the Arctic Ocean under the North Pole is going down 13,000 feet, which is way deeper than any being can go without possibly losing oxygen and being crushed. Even professional divers can only get down about 1,000 feet, and that's for a few hours at the most. And you had divers that have gone down into the ocean below the North Pole. And the crazy thing is, it is so cold, again, just above the freezing point, that you actually have areas that are frozen deeper down under the Arctic Ocean. You got blocks of ice and ice sheets almost 1,000 feet down into the Arctic Ocean. So again, you can only imagine just how much more the temperature drops the deeper you go down, and just how well preserved things would get the deeper you go down. But again, the only way you'd be able to reach those lower depths is with some type of specially designed submersible. There's just no way to get down that deep without a vehicle specially designed to get down there. Something that the average person is not going to have access to. And as far as we know, it wasn't until 1958 that they were finally able to send this submarine directly under the North Pole. And again, this was the very first documented submersible sent under the North Pole. The mission was called Operation Sunshine, and it was considered a scientific expedition because there was over 116 crew members. And out of that 116, there was quite a few scientists that were supposed to be measuring and mapping the seafloor. But the mission was actually labeled top secret. So all of the data that they collected is classified and to this day has never been released to the public. Now, this nuclear powered submarine that they used for this mission was named the USS Nautilus. And it's on official record that this submarine was named directly after the submarine in the book 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. Because in that book, the submarine is also called the Nautilus. And in the book, they used the Nautilus submarine to find Atlantis, an ancient advanced civilization buried deep under the ocean. And if you remember when the movie came out in 1954, same exact year that the USS Nautilus was commissioned, in the movie, the whole objective is to get to the central point of the Arctic, to get to the North Pole. This was the ultimate target of the Nautilus, was that volcanic mountain at the North Pole. This was supposedly where all these secrets were that they were trying to keep from the rest of humanity. And remember, the way that they entered into that mountain was through a cavern or a hole submerged deep under the ocean that ultimately connected to this giant opening in the earth. Remember, we got that other mountain ridge at the center of the Arctic Ocean, at the center of the North Pole, the Lomonosov Ridge. The ridge directly underneath the North Pole definitely has magmatic features, meaning that it's been affected by, some type of ancient volcanic activity, and that there are rifts or, openings that have formed within this ridge. And then when seismic waves hit this area, the velocities of the waves starts to increase, seeming to indicate that the waves are dropping deeper down into some type of open space, that there is some type of deeper structure in this part of the Arctic Ocean. And we know from the mapping of the ridge, there's clearly a giant cavernous section within this ridge. And it's literally sitting at the central point of the ridge, right in the middle of the ridge. And they actually call this thing the intra-basin because it's so large and so prominent. And again, sitting right at the center of this ridge, right at the center of that ridge, right at the center of the North Pole, we've got that deep depression, which you would think with it being right at the center of the Earth's axis, right at the center of all that centrifugal force, that it would be all of this a much more massive scale. And even though this thing is only visually dropping down about a mile down into the earth, they actually estimate that the sediment deformation within this thing reaches down to 41,000 meters. So about 25 miles down into the earth. They're detecting deformation within this thing. And 25 miles down into the earth is going to take you directly to the mantle, which again is ultimately going to lead you to that transition zone. And again, you got to wonder just how well preserved all of this would be, being submerged so deep under the Arctic Ocean and potentially being buried in ice for who knows how long. So again, at the North Pole and at the South Pole, we have nearly the same exact phenomena being detected. Signs of sediment deformation at the geographic pole going all the way down to the mantle.